I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 4 of the JFK assassination, 60 years later. Before we examine what happened to President Kennedy's body after new President Lyndon Johnson delivered it into the hands of the military, as I indicated in episode 2, we need to establish a foundation. And one part of that foundation is how America became a military nation, a national security state nation. And secondly, we want to do a brief examination of an agency called the Assassination Records Review Board, which came into existence in the 1990s. Now, in the last episode, I told you about how President Eisenhower had issued a warning to the American people in his farewell address in 1961 about the military-industrial complex. That was the term that he used for the national security establishment or the military intelligence establishment or the deep state. He said that this structure posed a grave threat to the rights and liberties of the American people and to the democratic processes of the American people. Now that's where the focus usually is, almost always is, when people are focusing on this farewell address. But we need to talk about something more fundamental here. President Eisenhower is acknowledging in this address that this change has taken place. Very few people, focus in on that because ordinarily the Americans subscribe to the quaint little notion that they learn in their civics classes in high school, where they're told that the federal government is divided into 3 branches: the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch, the Congress, and that these 3 branches have certain powers and they counterbalance each other, and that underneath the executive branch falls the military, and that we have civilian control over the military in this country, and they'll point to the Secretary of Defense being a civilian, although not always. Sometimes a military general slips in there. But that's the quaint little notion that we have. It doesn't recognize the monumental nature of the change, the transformation of the federal government that took place in the late 1940s from a limited government republic to a national security state or to a military-industrial complex. Eisenhower is recognizing that this change took place. Now, he implies that it was necessary because of the Cold War, the fight against the communists, and I challenge that. I think if you're going to fight communists, you should not copy the communists. And the communists were national security states too. The Soviet Union was a national security state. Russia today is a national security state. Red China, Cuba, and post-World War II, the United States. It's my conviction that you fight communism with freedom and limited government and free markets and so forth, not by adopting the principles and policies and positions of the communists. But nonetheless, what's important here is that Eisenhower is recognizing the significance of this change. As I also indicated, President Truman, he talked about the sinister force that the CIA had become in American life. And he published this op-ed in the Washington Post 30 days after the Kennedy assassination. It could not have been a coincidence. And he said that we should do what he really intended to do, was make the CIA simply an intelligence gathering institution rather than one engaged in operations. Now, there was actually a third president that issued the same kind of warning and concern that Eisenhower had issued, and that third president was President Kennedy himself. Kennedy had read a novel called 7 Days in May. And this novel was it was a fiction, okay? It posited that the military intelligence establishment was very dissatisfied with the president and figured that he was leading America in a very bad direction, in a direction that threatened national security. And so they conspired to take over, to save the country. Well, Kennedy was so impressed with this book that he decided that he'd like to see it made into a movie. And he contacted friends in Hollywood and persuaded them to turn this novel into a movie. He actually let the White House be used for some of the filming, much to the chagrin, no doubt, of the Pentagon and the CIA. But it's a great movie. It was ultimately turned to a movie. Interestingly enough, it was supposed to come out about the time of the Kennedy assassination, and they felt it would be prudent to delay it due to the insensitivity of the timing here. But it's a great movie. It stars Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, Ava Gardner, and other people. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's called 7 Days in May. And the reason Kennedy did this was because he saw this as a real threat to America, this apparatus of a national security state. In fact, in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, the Attorney General, is negotiating with a Russian diplomat to see if they can come up with a resolution of the crisis. And at this point, Kennedy is under a lot of pressure because the military is pressuring him to start bombing Cuba immediately to take out these nuclear missiles that the Soviets had established there. And what the CIA and the Pentagon didn't realize was that these missiles were fully operational and that they could have been fired the minute that the bombing started. Now, at the time, they needed to secure permission from Nikita Khrushchev, but who knows whether that permission would have been granted, and who knows whether some Soviet commander would have just said to heck with the permission, I'm going to defend myself here. So Kennedy was resisting this enormous pressure, and Bobby Kennedy told the Soviet diplomat, I think it was Dobrynin, I'm not positive, but I think it was Dobrynin, he said, if you want to get this crisis resolved, you need to tell Khrushchev that my brother is in very, very under a deep threat of a coup here, of a military coup, where the military just uses its power to take over. And Dobrynin knew he wasn't bluffing. And he goes back and tells Khrushchev this, and Khrushchev knew he wasn't bluffing, and Khrushchev knew at that point he needed to strike a deal. Because if the military were to take over, he knew that was almost certainly going to be World War III. And he was looking for a way out of this crisis the same way Kennedy was, without going into World War III. And so that's when they ended up striking the deal there in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what Kennedy's words show you that Kennedy was well aware of the threat that Eisenhower had enunciated in his farewell address. To better demonstrate the nature of America as a military nation, let me go to a foreign country, because I think it's really helpful to understand sometimes what happens over there to explain what happens over here. I'm referring to Chile in 1973. In that year, a war broke out between the executive branch of the government, represented by the president and the people in the executive branch, and the national security branch of the government, which demonstrated that you've got two separate branches here. And Chile had the same type of government that the United States had. They had a national security state, national security establishment. That was one branch. They had the executive branch, the presidency, and all the people in the executive branch. They had the legislative branch, the Congress, the Chilean Congress, and they had the judicial branch, a federal judiciary, just like here. Well, this war breaks out based on the principles in 7 Days in May. The Chilean military, and this is not fiction, this is fact. The Chilean military is deeply concerned over the policies and positions and philosophy of the democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. They think Allende's leading the country to a communist takeover. And so they decide they need to oust him from power. And so a war breaks out, and it's a violent war. They're trying to assassinate Allende. They're firing missiles into his position in the National Palace. Allende's got a military helmet on. He's got a high-powered weapon. He's got allies there, and he's shooting back. I mean, you've got infantry that's coming, surrounding his position in the National Palace from the National Security Branch. You got armor coming in. They've got jet planes firing missiles in his position. And he's firing back, but he's no match. There's no way that the executive branch under a national security state is any match for the military branch. And you'll recall when I read some of those quotes from our founding fathers about standing armies, and one of them was like, how would we stand against the power of an all-powerful military force? That it's virtually impossible due to the disparity in power. And Allende found that out. And at the end of this thing, Allende's dead. There's some dispute as to whether he committed suicide or whether he was murdered and made it look like a suicide, but it really doesn't matter because he was dead because of this military takeover. Now, in that circumstance, the National Security Branch, the military intelligence branch, took over, merged with the executive branch. I mean, it now became one branch, which could be called the National Security Executive Branch. It was just one branch under military control, but it wasn't a total military government. You still had two other branches still operating. You had the Chilean Congress that was still operating, and you had the federal judiciary that was still operating. The only thing is that they were operating in deference to the Pinochet regime. It was General Augusto Pinochet who was in charge. And he let them have the veneer of power. They were issuing rulings in the judiciary, and they were enacting laws in the legislature. So there was this veneer that that everything's sort of kind of like semi-normal, but it was anything but normal. And it was actually a veneer of power. He was making it look like they were still, independently operating and so forth. But it was just a veneer. And in fact, many, many years later, after Pinochet left office, the federal judiciary, through the lawyers serving at that time, actually issued a formal apology to the Chilean people for having abrogated their responsibility to stand up against this thing, because they were holding that this coup was constitutional, and they were upholding some of the actions that were being taken, like the roundups and the torture. They rounded up like 60,000 people, and they tortured them brutally, and the women were being raped, and there was 3,000 people killed or disappeared, and they were all because they were socialists or communists. Remember that this was the height of the Cold War, or at least the Cold War was still going on in 1973. And the U.S. was still battling the communists in Vietnam. So what they were doing to these people was considered no big deal, either by the Chilean government or by the U.S. government, because they were considered communists. And remember when I said that they were referring to people in Vietnam as gooks? Well, that's to dehumanize them. And that's the way these socialists that had been supporting Allende, who himself was a socialist, that's how they considered him. And so it was no big deal to torture him and disappear him and execute him and so forth. But the real point here is this veneer of power. And so here in this country, you've got three branches. This is Glennon's thesis. You've got the three branches. There's no merger between the military branch and the executive branch. You've got three that are still operating, unlike in Chile where two were operating. But it's the same thing. The military intelligence establishment is in charge, and over here, these three branches are permitted to have the veneer of power. The federal government's issuing its nice little rulings, and Congress is enacting laws, and the president's doing whatever he needs to be doing. But in actuality, it's just a veneer, that the real control lies right here. Now, a good example of this deference to authority by the federal judiciary to the military intelligence establishment comes in with respect to the power of assassination. You'll recall that I mentioned the Bill of Rights and that little grouping of amendments, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, one of which prohibits the federal government from killing people without due process of law. And due process of law means notice, like an indictment, formal notice of charges, and then a trial. And the Bill of Rights also guarantees a person the right of trial by jury, so that if people don't want to have a judge deciding their guilt or innocence, they can get regular people in the community to make that decision. Very unusual judicial system, but a very good one. And so it was clear that for 150 years or so, the government could not assassinate people because obviously assassination means killing without due process of law. You just snuffing out a person's life without affording them a chance for a trial or being accorded the right to have the formal charges against them for what they're being killed for. Well, once the CIA comes into existence, it has this omnipotent power of assassination, just like the communist regimes did. And nobody questions this. This is a military nation. Of course, the CIA has to have the power of assassination. How are we going to defeat the communists? They have the power of assassination. And sure enough, like I said earlier, the CIA starts, they have an assassination manual in 1952, and they actually orchestrated the assassination of Patrice Lumumba right before Kennedy comes into office because he supposedly poses a threat to U.S. national security. Well, the U.S. Congress, of course, has never touched this. I mean, they could enact a law saying we are prohibiting the CIA from assassinating people. It's a demonstration of this deference to authority. And then the federal judiciary, same thing. I mean, the job of the judiciary from the very beginning with the concept of judicial review is to nullify, to declare unconstitutional actions that the federal government takes that violate the provisions of the Constitution. And clearly assassination does that. Well, in 1970, going back to Chile, the U.S. wanted to have a coup in Chile at that time. They wanted to do anything to prevent Allende from being elected president. Allende had received a plurality of votes in the 1970 election, not a majority. And instead of having a runoff, the law in Chile was that the Congress would decide who's going to be the president. And like I say, Allende had a plurality. He had been leading in the final vote totals, and the U.S. officials tried bribing the members of the Chilean Congress into voting against him. But at the same time, they had another track that was calling for a coup, this takeover of the executive branch by the military branch. But the head of the Chilean armed forces was a man named General René Schneider, a man of the utmost integrity. He had a family, highly respected in Chile, and his response to U.S. officials was no. His position was that the Chilean Constitution provides for only two means of removing a president from office. One is the next election, and the other is through impeachment. And impeachment obviously wasn't going to work here because Allende wasn't in office yet. And so he was opposing this idea on principle. And so the CIA orchestrated his assassination. They figured he needed to be removed as an obstacle, and they orchestrated his violent kidnapping, a kidnapping attempt. And of course, the kidnappers, the thugs, knew that he had to be armed. I mean, he's a general, and he fought back, and they just massacred him there on the streets of Santiago. And the CIA has always claimed that they were just hoping to kidnap him but not kill him, which is ridiculous because how could they return him after kidnapping him? I mean, if they're going to remove him as the head of the Chilean armed forces, it would be a permanent thing. But in any event, the law is that when you engage in a felony like this and somebody dies, you're responsible as a matter of law for the killing as well. But nobody ever is brought to justice for this. Clearly there was a conspiracy. Yes, I know, conspiracy theory, conspiracy Jacob. I hear it all the time on the JFK assassination. But here there was a conspiracy, there's no doubt about it, in Washington and Virginia to orchestrate the kidnapping and assassination of Schneider. Nobody was ever brought to justice, okay? Nobody's ever indicted. Nobody's hauled before. I mean, this is out and out murder of an innocent man, totally innocent man here. Well, the Schneider children filed a lawsuit in federal district court against U.S. officials. I forget who the actual litigants were, the U.S. government. And the federal judiciary said, no, we can't get involved in this. We can't second guess the CIA and the military establishment here, the national security state, that they're the experts when it comes to foreign policy and assassination, and we're just judges, we're just lawyers. We can't second guess what they're doing in foreign policy. They're the experts. And so they threw the Schneider children out on their ear. They were suing for the murder, the state-sponsored murder of their father, and the federal judiciary says, no, we can't do that. Well, there's one great big hole in this deferential attitude, and that hole is the Fifth Amendment, the Due Process Clause. It's the job of the federal judiciary to enforce the Constitution. And the Fifth Amendment doesn't say, except for the Pentagon and the CIA. It says, no person shall be deprived of life without due process of law. And it was a restriction on the federal government. And the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA are part of the federal government. So all the federal judiciary had to do was say, the Due Process Clause controls here. You didn't have a right, you didn't have the legitimate authority to assassinate this man, and we're going to rule in favor of the Schneiders. They didn't do that. So that's what happens in a military nation, is that you have this veneer of power, but the real power lies with the military intelligence establishment. So that gives you an idea of what it's like to live in a military nation. Now let's move on to the next subject, and that's the Assassination Records Review Board. This was an independent agency that was brought into existence in the early 1990s. And before we examine the reasons for that, bringing that agency into existence, let's go back and just do a broad overview of what was going on with respect to investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. Of course, everybody knows about the Warren Commission and the Warren Report. Earl Warren was Chief Justice of the United States. He had been appointed by President Johnson to head up the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, of course, the fix was in from the very beginning. You've got all these highfalutin Washington, D.C. people appointed to this commission. I mean, look at the situation today. When you posit the notion that this was a regime change operation, what does the establishment press, the mainstream press, and the Washington, D.C. establishment say? Oh, conspiracy theory, right? That's really the only defense they have left of this. Conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. Well, Johnson appoints these kind of people to the Warren Commission. I mean, the most establishment people you could ever find. In other words, there was never any possibility that they would be looking at the possibility that the national security state carried out this assassination. I mean, you've got like Allen Dulles, who is former head of the CIA. Yeah, he's really going to be looking in that direction, in the direction of the CIA, especially since he was the guy that John Kennedy fired after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. But Johnson appoints him to be on the Warren Commission. And of course, Warren is Chief Justice of the United States. What chances are the Chief Justice of the United States is going to say, I think this could have been a regime change operation, or anybody else on the Warren Commission? There are all these establishment people. And so that there was never any possibility of that. But they come up with this official narrative that a lone nut ex-communist Marine has decided to kill the president. He's at the right place at the right time, and he has no apparent motive except for that he's a little man who wants to kill a big man and thereby become a big man. That was the most popular rationale, except for the fact that this little man who supposedly wanted to become a big man by assassinating a big man denied he did it, which is sort of inconsistent with becoming a big man for doing it. And then even further, he went one step further and said, in a very intriguing statement, says, I'm being set up. That's what Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin, was saying. I mean, I'm a patsy. That's what he said. And that means he's being set up, which means that he has somebody in mind or some entity in mind as to who set him up. So in any event, that was the official narrative. Oswald had gotten assassinated on Sunday after the assassination, and so the case was closed. Nothing to see here, folks. Move on. That's the official narrative, and of course, y'all have heard about the magic bullet theory. Well, in 1975, Gerardo Rivera shows on national television the Zapruder film. Now, Abraham Zapruder was a Dallas businessman who went out on November 22nd with his really nice, expensive home movie camera and filmed the assassination. I mean, if there was anybody who could be as close to a professional with movie making that as an amateur could be, it's Abraham Zapruder. He'd been taking home movies for years and years. He was really good at this. So he films the whole assassination. We'll talk about that in a later series because it's important. This is a critically important aspect of the whole assassination. But he ends up selling the film to Life magazine, who ends up sequestering it. They hide it from the American people. And but Gerardo Rivera gets a bootleg copy of the film in 1975. I don't know, what's that, 12 years or so after the assassination. And he shows it on national television. And you've got that violent back into the left movement, which implies a shot from the front, which contradicted what the official narrative from the Warren Commission had said, that all shots came from the rear by Lee Harvey Oswald. So people were outraged when they saw the film. And so they demand a reinvestigation. And people had never been satisfied. Most Americans had never been satisfied with this official version. People felt very uneasy about it. And so the House Select Committee on Assassinations, it comes up with a new investigation. And at the end of this investigation, they decide that there's a conspiracy based on some audio recordings that had been taken by a motorcycle cop. He had left his microphone on or his radio on, and they'd recorded all the gunshots, and some audio experts listened to it and said, oh, there's more than 3 shots here. And so that implies a conspiracy. But later people questioned it. But they shut it down. As soon as they determined there was a conspiracy, that was the end of the hearings, which to me is kind of weird. Once you decide there's a conspiracy, that would be the time to continue with the investigation. But they didn't do that. But then in 1991, Oliver Stone comes up with his movie JFK. And it's a fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. It got a lot of awards at the Academy Awards and so forth. And he posits that this was a national security regime change operation. That was the movie that I saw that exposed me to this whole thing. And at the end of the movie, Stone includes a little blurb that says they're still keeping most of their records secret. The House Select Committee investigation, the Warren Commission, the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon. They're keeping their records secret like to the year 2029 or something, which was like, it made no sense. If this is a lone nut that just happened to be at the right place at the right time, why all the secrecy? What's going on here, you see? And so people were outraged again. Because again, even though it was 30 years later, most Americans never bought the official version. They smelled a rat. Okay, nobody trusted the federal government after the assassination ever again, and rightly so. So this outrage pressures Congress into passing the JFK Records Act, which mandates that all these records have to be released to the public. This is, over the objections of the Pentagon and the CIA. They succeeded for 30 years and thought they had till 2029. Of course, when everybody around the assassination would be dead, and probably all the records destroyed by that time. But there was one quirk in this, and that's that President Bush, George H.W. Bush, who was president at the time, was a former director of the CIA. So ordinarily, you would expect that he would veto the bill, but he was running against Clinton that year, and Bill Clinton came out and said, "I favor this bill," and that put Bush in a box, and so Bush signed the bill, and it became the JFK Records Act, and so all these agencies had to start releasing their records to the public, and to enforce this act, they brought into existence the Assassination Records Review Board, an independent agency. And that was their job, to get it released. But there was 2 weird things about this thing. And one was that they were prohibited. Somebody has slipped a provision in the law that says the ARRB cannot reinvestigate the Kennedy assassination. All they can do is get records released, which I consider kind of weird, because if you come up with something that's suspicious, wouldn't you want the agency to investigate it? Well, they had no power, and it was a provision that the board of directors or trustees of the ARRB strictly enforced on the staff. And they made it clear that if you do this, you're subject to getting fired. And there were people on the staff that would monitor and watch. And if they saw somebody who looked like investigating this thing, they'd shut it. They'd call them on it. And the other weird provision was that the CIA and the Pentagon and these other agencies could keep some records secret at their behest, at their choice, for another 25 years. Based on national security or some form of national security. This was already 30 years after the assassination. They got another 25 years of secrecy. But even more interesting, the ARRB goes out of existence. I think it was in 1999 or so. So when the deadline comes due, there's no ARRB to enforce the law. So you had these two quirks going on. So that gives you an idea of the formation of the Assassination Records Review Board. Now, the staff of the ARRB did take it upon themselves to clarify the records, especially with respect to the medical evidence, because a member of Congress has said, look, the medical evidence has been messed up since the beginning. Can y'all please see what you can do to clarify this? So the general counsel, Jeremy Gunn, a lawyer, along with Doug Horn, who I've mentioned before, who is the author of Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, where I get a lot of my information on how the ARRB operated, they took it upon themselves to engage not in a reinvestigation, but in an effort to clarify the record. And it is with that effort to clarify the record that we are now prepared to move into what happened to the president's body after Lyndon Johnson delivered it into the hands of the military. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 4 of the JFK assassination 60 years later.